12 people applauded when Barrett Winthrop fired Calvin Marsh, and none of them knew they were applauding the man who had built the thing they were about to launch. 11 days before the Callaway Line's first public run, on the depot floor beneath a bank of humming service lights, the chief operating officer of Aldington Rail Systems held up a compliance printout she had not written and told a 38-year-old maintenance technician that his employment was terminated, effective immediately, for a paperwork discrepancy filed under his badge number. A chairman who has not set foot in this depot in a decade is about to walk back through its doors and ask for an engineer nobody on the current staff has ever heard of. He will use a name. It will be this one. Calvin did not raise his voice. He set his coffee down on the workbench, careful of the cord running to the diagnostic rig, and listened to Barrett Winthrop read the infraction number aloud the way a woman reads a verdict she has already decided is fair. Somewhere behind her, 2 junior technicians clapped. Not loudly, not long, just enough to be seen doing it, the kind of applause that exists to be noticed by whoever is standing closest to a promotion. Sylvia Kingsley, the newly hired lead systems engineer, did not clap. She watched Calvin's hands, which had not moved to defend anything, and filed the stillness away without understanding yet what it meant. What none of them knew, not Barrett, not the clapping technicians, not even Sylvia with her 18 months of tenure and her printed schematics, was that the braking control architecture running through every car of the Callaway Line, the system the entire 9-day certification clock depended on, had been drawn 15 years earlier by the same man now being asked to clear out his locker. He had signed those drawings under a subsidiary name long since folded into the parent company in ink nobody currently employed there had ever been shown. He had walked away from that title on purpose, for reasons that had nothing to do with failure and everything to do with a woman named Rosalind and a 5-year-old who needed her father home by 6. Calvin rolled his tool canvas closed around a scorched relay he'd pulled from the test bench the week before. A relay stamped with a serial number that, if anyone had checked the manufacturer's registry, had never officially been issued. He tucked it into the roll beside a folded wiring diagram, inked from memory, the paper gone soft at the creases from years of handling. Then he walked out past the applause, past Oliver Pruitt's clenched jaw, into a gray morning that did not care yet what he had built. Stay with this one. The answer to who he really is arrives less than a third of the way through, and it is only the beginning. 6 hours before any of that happened, the morning had looked like every other morning in the narrow rented duplex 2 blocks from the rail yard, and it had looked, deliberately, like nothing at all. Calvin stood at the stove in his sock feet, stirring oatmeal on a low flame, while Bertie sat at the kitchen table with one shoe on and one shoe still hunting for her under a chair. She was 8 now, all elbows and opinions, with her mother's habit of watching a room before she spoke in it. He set the bowl down, added the brown sugar she liked and none of the raisins she didn't, and reached across to straighten her collar, which had folded under itself again on the left side. She let him. She always let him, and never once asked why he did it every morning, instead of just once. 15 years earlier, Calvin Marsh had been the kind of engineer other engineers watched work. He'd come up through a small rail system subsidiary with a drafting table and a habit of solving braking control problems that had stumped men twice his seniority, and by 30 he had built, largely alone over 11 months, the architecture that would eventually carry his name nowhere at all, because the subsidiary was absorbed into Aldington Rail Systems before anyone thought to preserve the attribution. He hadn't minded then. There had been no reason to mind. He had a wife who read structural inspection reports the way other people read novels, cover to cover, looking for the sentence that didn't belong, and a house full of the particular noise 2 people make when they are both still young and neither of them is tired yet. Rosalind Marsh got sick when Bertie was 4. The illness took its time, the way the bad ones do, and Calvin spent the better part of a year learning to be in 2 places that could never actually be reached at once, the hospital corridor and the design floor, until the choice stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like the only decent thing left to do. She died when Bertie was 5. He buried her on a Tuesday and was back in a building by the following Monday, though not the one he'd left. He took a shift work position at the depot instead, quiet, steady, home every night by 6:15, and he let everyone who asked assume he was simply a technician, because correcting them would have meant explaining a version of himself he no longer had the appetite to defend. He walked Bertie to school the long way that morning, past the chain-link fence where the new high-speed cars sat gleaming and idle, because she liked to count them. 4, she said. 5, if you count the one that doesn't move yet. He told her that was the one still being taught how. She considered this with the seriousness she gave everything and said nothing else until the crossing guard waved her through, and Calvin stood a moment longer than necessary, watching the school doors close behind a girl who had never once, in 3 years, asked him to be anyone other than exactly who he was. The compliance infraction Barrett Winthrop read aloud that morning had, in fact, originated 11 months earlier, in a procurement filing Calvin had never touched and never signed, though his badge number sat at the bottom of it the way a fingerprint sits on a doorknob someone else opened. Barrett did not know that. Barrett knew optics, and the optics of a coming launch demanded a clean compliance sheet, and a clean compliance sheet demanded someone be shown the door before the press arrived. She read the infraction number the way she read everything, off a card, without looking up, and beside her, Sylvia Kingsley crossed her arms and said, not unkindly, that the depot couldn't run on sentiment when a 9-figure launch was riding on paperwork discipline. It was, Sylvia would later admit, the second time that week she had dismissed something Calvin said without checking whether he was right. The first time had been 40 minutes earlier, on the floor, when Calvin had quietly noted that a relay cycling pattern in car 4 looked irregular against the diagnostic baseline, and Sylvia, reading her own printout, had told him the baseline was fine and the irregularity was almost certainly a sensor artifact. He hadn't pushed. He rarely pushed. He'd only said, mildly, that artifacts don't usually repeat every 90 seconds like a heartbeat, and she had smiled the particular smile of someone who has already moved on to the next task, and moved on. Oliver Pruitt, 61 years old and floor supervisor for longer than most of the current staff had been alive, was the only one who said anything when Barrett handed Calvin the termination form. He said it was a mistake. He said it twice, in fact, the second time louder, and Barrett told him this wasn't a discussion, it was a notification, and the difference mattered to her more than it mattered to anyone else in the room. Oliver knew things about Calvin that nobody else on that floor knew them because Calvin had let it slip once, on a night shift 4 years back, over lukewarm coffee, that he'd once drawn breaking architecture for a living and simply preferred bolts to boardrooms now. Oliver had never repeated it. He repeated it now, quietly, to Barrett's back as she walked away, and she did not turn around. Calvin gathered his tool roll, the scorched relay, the folded diagram, the ordinary wrenches that had nothing to do with any of it. With the same unhurried hands he used for everything, hands that moved toward a task before his eyes had finished confirming it needed doing. He did not argue his case. He did not ask for a hearing. He said only that the infraction wasn't his, in a voice so level it barely registered as a defense at all, and when nobody responded he nodded once, as if confirming something to himself rather than to the room, and walked out into a morning that had already decided what kind of day it would be. 3 days later, at 6:52 in the morning, the Callaway Line's braking control system failed its final certification test for the second time that week, locking up at 9% past optimal deceleration in a way that 11 engineers, 4 consultants, and 1 increasingly desperate compliance officer could not explain. Barrett Winthrop stood in the observation booth above the test track with the launch calendar taped to the wall behind her, 8 days remaining circled in red pen, and did the math on her own board vote before she did the math on the train. She told Oliver Pruitt, in a tone she clearly hoped sounded like a suggestion rather than a surrender, to see if the old technician, she did not use Calvin's name, might be willing to come in and look at something, unofficially, off the books, as a favor. Calvin came because Oliver asked, not because Barrett did. He arrived in the same faded gray jacket, the depot patch still half peeled at the corner, and said nothing to anyone as he walked past the cluster of engineers arguing over a diagnostic printout spread across 3 monitors. Sylvia Kingsley was among them, jaw tight, insisting the fault had to be a firmware timing error because the hardware had passed every isolated bench test they'd run. Calvin didn't correct her. He didn't join the argument at all. He walked to the relay bank at the rear of car 4, crouched beside the housing, and simply listened. He stayed there a long time, long enough that one of the consultants asked, not quite to his face, whether the old man understood this was a certification test and not a tune-up. Long enough that Sylvia glanced over twice, Irritated the first time, and something closer to curious the second, because Calvin hadn't opened a single panel or requested a single printout. He had his palm flat against the housing and his head tilted a half-inch, the way a man tilts his head toward a sound only he has decided is worth hearing, while the relay bank cycled beneath his hand at 90-second intervals. Click and pause, click and pause. A rhythm the engineers had reduced to a waveform on a screen, and Calvin was receiving as something closer to a voice. The room around him kept arguing. Timing errors, firmware patches, a theory involving thermal drift in the sensor array that took 11 minutes to propose and 9 to dismantle. Calvin said nothing through any of it. He simply stayed where he was, crouched at the relay bank, palm against the housing, listening to a pattern nobody else in that room had been trained to hear as anything other than data. At the 18-minute mark, without straightening up, without raising his voice, Calvin said that the relay in position 4C wasn't the same part number as the other 5 in the bank. Sylvia turned, already prepared to correct him a third time, and pulled the digital manifest to check. It took her 4 minutes to find the discrepancy he'd already found by ear in under 20. Calvin pulled the relay with a screwdriver he'd carried in his own roll for 6 years and held it up to the light the way another man might hold up something he'd found in the dirt and wasn't sure yet was valuable. The casing was the right color, the right size, close enough to pass a glance and close enough apparently to pass whatever inspection had certified it 18 months ago. But the internal gauge was wrong, thinner than spec, and the resistance curve under load would drift exactly the way this one had been drifting. A fault so quiet it only showed itself as a heartbeat once every 90 seconds, easy to write off as an artifact if you were reading a printout instead of the part itself. Sylvia took the relay from his hand without asking permission, turned it over, and found a serial number stamped into the base that meant nothing to her until she cross-referenced it, out of habit more than hope, against the archived architecture files from the system's original design. She was looking for a part number match. She found something else instead, a hand-inked schematic from 15 years ago, the braking control architecture for the entire platform, signed at the bottom corner in a draftsman's careful print. Marsh, C. She read it twice. She looked up at Calvin, who was already wiping his hands on a rag, unbothered, as if he had not just handed her the answer to a question she hadn't known to ask. The room went quiet the particular way a room goes quiet when several people realize at once that they have been condescending to someone for reasons that no longer make sense. Nobody applauded this time. Barrett Winthrop, standing at the back with the launch calendar folded under one arm, said nothing at all, and her silence carried more weight than anything she might have chosen to say instead. What the room did not yet know, what even Sylvia, staring at a 15-year-old signature, had not yet worked out, was that the part Calvin had pulled from Car 4 wasn't a manufacturing defect or an isolated error. It was the same relay, or its twin, installed as a matter of policy across a fleet that was 11 days from carrying passengers, and someone inside Aldington Rail Systems had spent 2 years making sure nobody looked closely enough to notice. The compliance logs that should have shown exactly when that relay was ordered, approved, and installed turned out, when Sylvia went looking for them that same afternoon, to be missing in the specific and deliberate way that data goes missing when someone has taken the trouble to delete it, rather than simply losing it. 11 months of procurement records sat intact. The 4-week window in which the substitute relay had first appeared in the parts log was gone, cleanly excised, the kind of gap a careless person leaves and a careful one erases. Barrett Winthrop found Calvin in the depot break room 2 mornings later, alone, drinking coffee from a paper cup, and sat across from him with the posture of a woman rehearsing a sentence she did not enjoy saying. She told him the board vote on her leadership renewal was in 9 days, the same week as the launch, and that a public safety scandal attached to her name would end both at once. She said the word optics before she said anything true. Then she offered him his job back, full reinstatement, backdated pay, and a non-disclosure agreement that would keep the relay discrepancy framed as an internal engineering matter, resolved quietly, no further inquiry required. Calvin turned the paper cup a quarter turn on the table before he answered. He said he'd sign a lot of things in his life. He wasn't going to sign one that asked him to forget which relay killed a man's braking margin by 9%. Barrett told him this wasn't about forgetting, it was about timing, about protecting a launch that 11 days of scandal could sink for a company employing 4,000 people. Calvin said, without heat, that he understood the difference between protecting a company and protecting whoever had made the decision to hide the discrepancy in the first place, and that he wasn't sure Barrett had worked out yet which one she was actually offering to protect. She left without the signature. Calvin stayed in the break room a while longer, turning the empty cup, thinking not about Barrett Winthrop's board vote, but about a folded note taped inside the lid of a drafting case in his hall closet, one he hadn't opened in 3 years and was beginning to think he might need to. Oliver Pruitt had spent 31 years learning where a rail depot kept its ghosts, and it was Oliver who remembered 2 nights later that the depot's original division, the one folded into Aldington Rail Systems before most current employees had been hired, had run its own server for records, decommissioned on paper but never physically unplugged, humming quietly in a back closet behind 3 decades of accumulated spare parts. He and Calvin found it together after hours, under a tarp that smelled of machine oil, its status light blinking green the way something forgotten sometimes keeps working long after everyone assumes it's dead. The server still carried automatic backups under the old division's name, untouched because nobody currently at Aldington knew the name existed to search it. Inside were 4 weeks of procurement data that matched, almost to the hour, the gap deleted from the main system, purchase orders for the substitute relay routed through a supplier called Northcott Component Partners, approved and signed off by Quentin Beaumont, Director of Procurement, 52 years old, a man Calvin had exchanged perhaps a dozen sentences with in 4 years of employment. What the backup revealed, and what it took Oliver another day of digging through public filings to confirm, was that Northcott Component Partners was not, as its paperwork implied, an independent vendor. It was partly owned, through a shell entity 3 layers removed from his own name, by Quentin Beaumont himself, and the cheaper relay had let him quietly pocket the difference on a 2-year contract while falsifying the compliance logs to make the substitution look like a routine part revision rather than what it actually was. Calvin didn't say much when Oliver laid it out. He looked at the relay in his tool roll, the one with the serial number that had never officially existed, and understood that it had never been an accident at all. It had been a decision, made once, and then defended by silence for 2 years. The clock, already tight, tightened further the next morning, when Sylvia discovered that Beaumont had authorized an accelerated shipment of the same relay, thousands of units, to be installed fleet-wide within the week, ahead of the Callaway Line's public launch. Framed internally as a proactive hardware upgrade, it would, if completed, make the substandard part standard equipment before anyone thought to ask why it had ever been substandard in the first place. The evidence Calvin and Oliver had just uncovered had, at most, 4 days left to matter. The morning of the certification ceremony, the depot floor had been swept, chaired, and strung with a single blue banner reading Callaway Line, certified for service, and it was into that half-finished ceremony that Bertram Aldington walked, 68 years old, in a coat older than most of the engineers present, asking a startled receptionist a question nobody on the current staff could answer. "Where is my engineer?" He did not mean Sylvia Kingsley, whose title said engineer, and who stood at the podium with her prepared remarks already trembling slightly in one hand. He meant a name he had personally approved 15 years earlier, when the braking control architecture crossed his desk under a small subsidiary he had since folded, quietly and without fanfare, into the parent company he'd spent 40 years building. He had never sold that division. He had simply absorbed it, and with it, unknowingly, its author's credit. Calvin was found at the relay bank, where he'd spent most of the morning helping Sylvia verify the fleet-wide swap had been halted in time. He came to the front of the room in his gray jacket, the depot patch still half peeled, carrying the canvas tool roll he never left behind, and Bertram Aldington crossed the floor to shake his hand the way a man greets someone he has been trying without knowing it to find for a decade and a half. What followed was not a spectacle. Sylvia laid the evidence out plainly, in order the way Calvin himself might have done it: the mismatched relay, the deleted compliance window, the backup server under the old division's name, the shell ownership behind Northcott Component Partners. The accelerated shipment halted with 6 units already loaded onto delivery trucks. Quentin Beaumont was not in the room. He had been quietly escorted to a meeting with legal counsel an hour earlier, and his departure from the company, when it came that afternoon, would be handled the way these things are handled: a statement, a resignation, a matter for auditors and not for headlines. Barrett Winthrop stood at the podium where her prepared remarks had been meant to announce a launch, and instead announced something harder to say. She did not call it a mistake in judgment or a communication gap. She said she had looked at a compliance printout and seen a name she didn't recognize attached to a discrepancy she didn't understand, and had decided the fastest solution was also the right one, and that neither of those things had been true. She said she owed Calvin Marsh an apology with no conditions attached to it, and gave one, in plain sentences, without once using the word optics. Bertram Aldington offered Calvin his old title backdated 15 years of recognition if such a thing were possible, and a bonus large enough to make Sylvia's eyebrows lift from across the room. Calvin held the canvas roll against his side and said no to all three, gently, the way he'd said no to Barrett's NDA days earlier, without drama and without apparent effort. In his jacket pocket, folded soft at the creases, was a note he'd taken that morning from inside the lid of his old drafting case, in Rosalind's handwriting, dated the week Birdie was born. Proud of the work, prouder that you come home for dinner. He had read it twice before leaving the house. He did not read it aloud now. He only held it and said that what he wanted instead was a fund run through the depot, training technicians the way nobody had ever bothered training him formally. Call it the Rosalind Marsh Apprenticeship, after a woman who'd spent her life checking other people's work for the flaw nobody else had caught. She never asked what I built, he said, when Bertram pressed him for a reason. She only asked if I came home. Nobody in that room offered a response to that, and nobody needed to. 5 months later, on an ordinary gray morning, a small brass plaque went up beside the depot door, screwed into the brick just below eye level for an 8-year-old, the Rosalind Marsh Apprenticeship. Birdie traced the letters with one finger on her way to school, the way she had every morning since it was installed, not because anyone asked her to, but because it had become, without either of them naming it, a ritual the two of them now shared. Calvin waited by the door, keys in hand, watching her finish the last letter before he locked up behind her. The Callaway line ran on schedule now, its relays inspected under a new procurement protocol Sylvia had built with Calvin's quiet input and Oliver's institutional memory, and its braking control architecture credited on a small interior plaque no passenger would ever stop to read, to C. Marsh, Chief Design Consultant. Calvin had accepted that title on his own terms. Part-time, floor-based, home by 6:15 every night. No different in practice than the life he'd already built, only now correctly named. They walked past the rail yard the long way, the way they always had, and Birdie counted the cars out of habit rather than necessity, all of them moving now, none of them waiting to be taught. She asked him, without looking up from the fence line, whether the depot used to know he built the trains before, or if they only found out because of the fired part. Calvin considered the question the way he considered everything, unhurried, and told her that most people don't find out what someone's made of until something breaks and shows them. She nodded once, satisfied, and reached for his hand at the crossing the way she still did some mornings, though she was getting too old to need it, and neither of them ever said so. If you believe quiet competence deserves to be seen before the applause starts, you already understand why he stayed.